Not everyone who looks at the sky understands what they see. 2,800,000,000 miles away, beyond Jupiter and Saturn, an impossible world spins. A planet that defies all the rules we know about life, about home, about what it means to be human. Uranus, the ice giant that rolls sideways through the cosmos, as if it was hit by a cosmic blow so violent that it still carries the scar of that ancient wound. Here there is no solid ground to walk on, no blue seas to sail, no mountains to climb or valleys to explore. Uranus isn't made of earth and stone like our terrestrial home, but of dense and mysterious fluids. Ammonia ice suspended in compressed hydrogen, oceans of liquid methane that have never known the light of the sun, and layers of superheated water that remain liquid only due to the overwhelming pressure of a world that weighs 14 times more than Earth. From a distance, through telescopes, Uranus seems serene, a blue-green sphere, smooth as a cosmic pearl, silent in its distant orbit. But that silence is the greatest of illusions. Inside this seemingly calm giant winds up to 900 miles an hour, sliced through the atmosphere without rest, creating storms that could swallow entire continents. In its depths, unimaginable pressures, millions of times greater than at the bottom of our oceans, crush any known structure, turn ice into metal, and make diamonds float like sand. And yet, despite all this cosmic hostility, a question echoes in the most audacious minds of humanity. What if we weren't just distant observers? What if, instead of simply studying Uranus through probes and telescopes, we decided to do something completely impossible? What if we dared to call this cold, distant world home? The answer to that question requires more than courage. It requires more than advanced technology or immense resources. It requires imagining a transformation so radical it would question the very essence of what it means to be human. A fragile body designed to breathe oxygen and walk on solid ground would attempt to exist on an ice giant where there is no ground, where the air is poison, where gravity would crush our bones, and the cold would freeze our blood in seconds. But humanity has always been driven by the impossible. We were a species that came out of caves to build cities, that left Earth to touch the moon, that turned dreams into reality through the power of imagination and determination. If we managed to survive in the depths of the ocean and the vacuum of space, why couldn't we reinvent our own nature to inhabit a world that was never made for us? Would it be possible to create floating cities in the high layers of the Uranian atmosphere? Could we develop technologies to transform toxic methane into breathable air? Would we be able to modify our own bodies to withstand pressures that turn rocks into dust? What kind of culture would be born in a place where there is no horizon, where the concept of sky is just a distant memory of the Earth we left behind? Uranus would become the ultimate laboratory of human transformation, a place where our species would not only survive through adaptation, but would completely reinvent itself, discovering new ways of existing that transcend the biological limits we've carried for millennia. And perhaps, in the process of conquering this impossible world, we would discover that the greatest transformation would not happen in our bodies or in our technologies, but in the profound understanding of who we truly are. Maybe we would learn that being human is not a matter of physical form, but of the persistence of consciousness, the ability to dream, and the refusal to accept limits as definitive. Because Uranus, with all its furious winds and crushing pressures, would offer us the greatest gift a world can give, the opportunity to discover that we are so much more than we ever imagined ourselves to be. If this kind of content sparks your imagination and faith, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who loves exploring the mysteries of the universe. Before Uranus could truly become our home, before we could reinvent our own biology, We would need to take the first cautious steps in conquering this impossible world, not in the crushing depths of the core, where unimaginable pressures turn water into exotic forms of ice, but in the intermediate layers of the atmosphere, regions where the gases, though lethal and hostile, could be tamed by human ingenuity. Our first inhabitants of Uranus would not be unprotected settlers, but pioneers enveloped in technological exoskeletons that would completely redefine the concept of a spacesuit. These would not be simple protective clothes, but living technological organisms, biotissues created through adaptive nanotechnology that would function as an intelligent second skin. Imagine suits that breathe toxic methane and transform it into clean oxygen through biological filtering chambers integrated into the very structure of the equipment. Each fiber would be programmed to absorb the weak solar radiation that manages to penetrate the dense atmosphere of Uranus, radiation almost imperceptible at this distance from the sun, and redistribute it as vital heat to keep the human body warm in temperatures that can reach 200 degrees below zero. But living inside these exoskeletons would take a deep emotional toll. Every movement would be filtered through mechanical servos and strength amplifiers. Breathing would cease to be a natural and unconscious act. It would be a heavy, slow, almost liquid chemical process, where each inhalation would be the result of complex filtering and gas recycling. The air in our lungs would have a metallic taste, a strange density, as if we were always breathing underwater. The views of the Uranian world would be limited by reflective visors, designed to withstand not only the extreme cold, but also the corrosion caused by ammonia vapors and chemical compounds that would dissolve conventional materials in minutes. Sounds would arrive muffled and distorted by the protective shell. The voices of other settlers would sound electronic, artificial, devoid of the human warmth we know on Earth. Physical touch, that basic need of human nature, would be completely eliminated. Hands gloved by chemical protections could never directly touch another person. Hugs would be mediated by layers of shielding. The simple act of feeling the texture of a surface would be impossible. Everything would be filtered through sensors that would translate tactile information into electrical signals. To compensate for these limitations, the suits would integrate direct neural interfaces, allowing settlers to control vital functions through thought impulses. Increase body heating, expand shielding against storm, activate oxygen reserves. All these commands would be executed instantly by simple mental intention, creating a symbiosis between the human brain and technology that would be both liberating and hauntingly intimate. Over time, the pioneers of Uranus would learn to move with supernatural grace through the planet's lower gravity, almost as if they were perpetually in slow motion. Jumps that on Earth would last seconds would extend for long moments, allowing the settlers to fly from platform to platform through the floating structures they would build in the habitable gas layers. These first colonies would be true technological islands suspended in the atmosphere, pressurized laboratories, command centers, and living quarters connected by flexible tunnels that would undulate with the constant winds. From inside these structures, through large windows of resistant, transparent material, the settlers would contemplate landscapes that no human eye had ever seen. Blue horizons that curve infinitely, methane clouds that form ever-moving sculptures, and strange auroras created by the interaction between Uranus's chaotic magnetic field and cosmic particles. But even with this first victory, the ability to survive and build in the atmospheric layers of Uranus, a profound question would remain echoing in the mind of each settler. During each chemically processed breath, during each mechanically amplified movement, during each night spent enveloped in protective shielding, can this really be called human life? Or would it just be a sophisticated form of survival where technology keeps us? alive, but gradually distances us from our own humanity. And yet, this would be our first real victory over an impossible world, the first step of a journey that would test not only our technological ingenuity, but our ability to redefine what it means to be human in a universe much vaster and stranger than we ever imagined. Life in suits would be just the beginning, a transitional phase in the great transformation that would await us on Uranus. If we truly wanted to call this cold world our permanent home, if we wished to build not just temporary colonies, but a new civilization, we would need to take a much more radical step, completely abandon external technological dependence and modify our very biological essence. The human body, that masterpiece of terrestrial evolution perfectly adapted to the environment of our home planet, would be completely inadequate for the Uranian reality. So would begin the most audacious process ever attempted by our species, the radical bioengineering of our own nature. The red blood that runs in our veins, full of iron and oxygen, would become an evolutionary memory. In its place, a dense, bluish liquid would flow through our bodies, rich in complex antifreeze molecules and exotic metallic compounds capable of transporting energy even in the extreme temperatures of Uranus. This new blood would be like an organic coolant, keeping our organs functioning even when the surrounding temperature plummeted to levels that would instantly crystallize common human blood. Our lungs, those delicate organs that evolved to process terrestrial oxygen, would be completely useless in the toxic atmosphere of Uranus. In their place, specialized cavities would develop in our torsos, organic biofilters capable of extracting energy directly from atmospheric methane and ammonia compounds, transforming poisonous gases into vital fuel through chemical processes that would combine modified photosynthesis with a completely new metabolism. Our soft skin, sensitive to touch and vulnerable to the elements, would undergo a dramatic metamorphosis. It would become a flexible shield, composed of overlapping chitinous plates, translucent as glass, but resistant as steel, capable of reflecting harmful radiation while allowing for the selective absorption of energy. These skin plates would glow softly with internal bioluminescence, creating patterns of light that would serve as a new form of visual communication. The body structure would also adapt radically. The tall, slender bodies we developed in Earth's gravity would give way to lower, more compact forms, optimized for Uranus's lower gravity, but with dramatically reinforced bone structure. Our skeletons would be rebuilt with organic materials closer to living titanium than calcium, capable of withstanding the variable pressures of the different atmospheric layers where we would live. Human eyes, designed to capture the abundant light of the terrestrial sun, would be useless. In the permanent twilight of Uranus, they would evolve into completely different sensory organs, structures capable of detecting infrared radiation, magnetic fields, and atmospheric pressure variations. We would see the world not as an illuminated landscape, but as a dynamic map of energies. Currents of heat dancing through gases, magnetic force lines creating invisible geometries, and movements of air masses forming temporary sculptures detectable only by our new perception. Communication would also be revolutionized. Human vocal cords would not be able to produce audible sounds amidst the constant methane winds and variable pressures of the Uranian atmosphere. Speech, that fundamental characteristic of humanity, would disappear completely. In its place, a language based on electromagnetic pulses, transmitted directly from brain to brain, would develop, a technological telepathy that would make communication more intimate and precise than spoken words ever could be. Over time, these changes would create beings who would maintain human consciousness and intelligence, but in bodies that would seem alien to the eyes of those who remained on Earth. Slightly curved postures optimized for atmospheric movement, glowing skin that would change color with mood and temperature, and elongated limbs adapted for three-dimensional navigation through dense gases. And yet, at the center of these dramatic transformations, something would remain irreducibly human. The curiosity that led us to the stars, the ability to create art and find beauty even in hostile environments, and the impulse to connect with other conscious beings and build societies based on cooperation and mutual care. The first post-humans of Uranus would carry in their modified cells not only adaptations for survival, but also genetic memories of our terrestrial origin, organic codes that would preserve our ability to dream, to love, to seek meaning even in a world that challenges all expectations of where life can flourish. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, would you live on Uranus? What city are you watching this documentary from? Let's chat in the comments. What would it really be like to live day to day on Uranus? How would an entire society function, built on a world with no solid ground, no blue sky, without the familiar cycle of day and night that rhythms all terrestrial life? Cities could not exist on foundations of concrete or stone, as there is simply no solid surface on which to build. Instead, they would float like technological archipelagos through the habitable atmospheric layers, sustained by a combination of controlled magnetic fields and the harnessing of the air currents themselves. These aerial metropolises would be true islands of civilization, perpetually navigating through Uranus's deep blue sky, ascending and descending through the gas layers according to resource needs and atmospheric conditions. Imagine organic structures that grow instead of being built, buildings cultivated from modified organisms capable of processing atmospheric methane and transforming it into living construction materials. Walls that breathe and self-repair, ventilation systems that are literally vascular tissues transporting filtered air, and windows that are transparent membranes capable of contracting or expanding according to external pressure. Inside these floating cities, there would be no streets in the traditional sense. The inhabitants would move through pressurized transition chambers, flexible tunnels that would extend and retract as needed, and passages that would serve for both transport and social communication. The reduced gravity of Uranus would allow for completely new forms of locomotion. Long and graceful jumps that would be more like controlled flights, and three-dimensional movements that would transform every displacement into a kind of aerial dance. Eating would represent a complete revolution in relation to terrestrial habits. There would be no agriculture as we know it, nor animal husbandry. Instead, nutrition would come from molecular synthesis systems that would transform the abundant compounds in the Uranian atmosphere, mainly methane and ammonia, into basic nutrients through biochemical processes controlled by artificial intelligence. Eating would become a much more scientific than sensory act. Each meal would be precisely calculated to provide the exact energy needed, with artificial flavors created to maintain some semblance of Earth's taste memories. Beverages would be mineral fluids, extracted from the deeper atmospheric layers, rich in rare elements that would help keep the modified biological systems functioning properly. Pure water would be an extreme luxury, reserved for special occasions and treated almost as a sacrament, each sip a liquid memory of the world they left behind. Work would take on completely new forms. Many terrestrial professions would simply not exist. There would be no farmers cultivating soil, no fishermen sailing oceans, no miners excavating mountains. Instead, unique specialties would emerge. Atmospheric cultivators responsible for maintaining the air currents that sustain the cities, pressure engineers who would constantly monitor habitability conditions, and magnetic field artists who would create energy sculptures visible only through the inhabitants' modified senses. Communication based on telepathic electromagnetic transmissions, would create a surprisingly silent but deeply connected society. Conversations would happen without sounds, through thought pulses that would allow for levels of intimacy and understanding impossible in terrestrial verbal communication. Lying would be virtually impossible, as emotions and intentions would be transmitted along with factual information. This new mode of communication would also revolutionize art and entertainment. Completely new forms of creative expression would emerge. Mental sculptures created through the synchronization of multiple minds, symphonies of thought that could be played by groups of telepathic artists, and narrative experiences where stories would be lived directly in the consciousness of the viewers instead of simply being told. Time would be measured in a completely different way. Uranus takes 8. The collective psychology would be deeply marked by this absence of defined horizons and the constant presence of the infinite void. There would be no distant mountains promising adventure, nor oceans suggesting mysteries beyond the horizon. The sky would be just a deep blue twilight stretching infinitely in all directions, creating a simultaneous feeling of total freedom and complete isolation. And yet, in this impossible environment, fundamental human nature would find ways to flourish. Families would form based not only on genetic ties, but on deep telepathic synchronizations. New traditions would emerge, elevation ceremonies where entire communities would move their cities to higher altitudes to celebrate important moments, and silence rituals where groups would temporarily turn off their telepathic communications to experience solitude in a hyper-connected world. Children would grow up learning to navigate three-dimensionally before learning to walk, developing spatial instincts that no terrestrial child could imagine. Games would involve manipulating smaller magnetic fields, creating bubbles of colored air, and collective dances that would take advantage of the reduced gravity to create choreographies impossible on Earth. It would be a daily life that was completely alien and, paradoxically, deeply human. Because in the end, no matter what planet we were on, we would continue to do what humanity has always done: create communities, care for each other, seek beauty and meaning, and build civilizations that reflect our deepest dreams. But every radical transformation comes at a price, and the price of life on Uranus would be measured not only in physical changes, but in deep and irreversible losses of fundamental aspects of the human experience that have defined our species for millions of years of evolution. The first post-humans of Uranus would discover a devastating truth. Every adaptation needed to survive in their new world meant the permanent abandonment of some essential part of what we knew as terrestrial humanity. Their shielded, translucent skins, though perfectly suited to withstand the crushing pressures and extreme temperatures that would turn any common human body to dust, could never again feel the soft touch of a warm breeze or the comforting texture of sand between their toes. The very concept of touch, that silent language through which we express love, solace, and connection, would become completely obsolete. They could perceive variations in pressure and temperature through neural sensors integrated into the new skin. They could even calibrate these sensors to detect the smallest environmental changes, but the intimate and deeply emotional experience of human physical contact would disappear forever. They would never again feel the hand of a loved one squeezing theirs in moments of fear. They would never again know the comforting embrace that calms internal storms, and they would never again experience the thrill of pleasure that runs through the skin when touched by someone loved. The complete absence of sound would represent an even more devastating loss for the human soul. Without functional vocal cords and without a suitable atmospheric medium to transmit the familiar sound waves that have cradled our existence since the maternal womb, all the incomparable richness of the human auditory experience would disappear as if it had never existed. The inhabitants of Uranus would never again hear the crystalline laughter of a child discovering the world, the affectionate whisper of the wind through the leaves of a tree, or the consoling rhythm of a lullaby that calms night fears. Their telepathic communications, although infinitely more efficient and allowing for levels of mental intimacy impossible on Earth, could never reproduce the unique melody in a mother's voice calling her child's name, the raw emotion transmitted by a sigh of relief, or the music that is born when human voices harmonize in a chorus. Music, that universal language that transcends cultural barriers and touches the soul directly, would be reduced to increasingly distant memories, ghostly echoes, of a world that existed only in the past. Tears, that purest and most universal expression of human emotion, could not exist in the completely modified eyes of the inhabitants of Uranus. Their new sensory organs, magnificently adapted to perceive infrared radiation, magnetic fields, and pressure variations that would be invisible to terrestrial eyes, simply would not possess the tear glands that have allowed humanity to cry from sadness, joy, relief, or nostalgia throughout our evolutionary history. How would they then express these fundamental emotions that define conscious experience? How would they process deep emotional losses without the cathartic and purifying escape valve that tears have represented for our species since time immemorial? How would they celebrate moments of extreme joy without being able to cry from happiness, as our terrestrial biology allows us to do? The very concept of beauty, that aesthetic impulse that connects us with the transcendent, would be radically transformed, perhaps even unrecognizable. On Earth, our perception of beauty is deeply intertwined with specific sensory experiences that evolved with us. The infinite blue of the sky that makes us dream of freedom, the vibrant green of forests that connects us with abundant life, the mesmerizing gold of a sunset that reminds us of the sacred passage of time, the delicate aroma of flowers that awakens memories of past springs and promises of renewal. On Uranus, where the landscape would be eternally composed only of subtle gradations of deep blue and hypnotic movements, of gases invisible to the common human eye, what new criteria for beauty could emerge? Could the inhabitants develop completely alien aesthetic sensitivities based on perceptions of dancing magnetic fields or radiation patterns that no terrestrial human would be able to understand or appreciate? The loss of intimate connection with nature, that symbiotic relationship that has shaped every aspect of our psychology, would be particularly devastating for the human soul. For millions of years, our species evolved in deep harmony with natural cycles that became an integral part of our identity, the sunrise and sunset that rhythm our days, the seasonal changes that teach us about renewal and impermanence, the growth of plants that connects us with the mysteries of life, the behavior of animals that reminds us of our common origin in the web of existence. On Uranus, none of this would exist. Without seasonal variations, without natural organic life, without defined horizons that promise adventures beyond the known, the inhabitants would completely lose that profound sense of natural time and biological connection with the environment that has shaped our entire evolutionary psychology. They would exist in an eternal twilight, disconnected from the cosmic rhythms that have always guided humanity through the seasons of life. Memories of Earth would become simultaneously more precious and more torturous with each generation that was born and died on Uranus. The original settlers, those brave pioneers who made the impossible journey, would still carry in their transformed minds vivid and painful sensory memories. The unmistakable smell of rain touching dry earth, the pleasurable feeling of warm sand between their toes, the relaxing sound of ocean waves breaking eternally against the beach. But their descendants, children born under the deep blue sky of Uranus, growing up in floating cities, breathing processed methane, would never experience these sensations that have defined the human experience for millennia. How could they truly understand poetic descriptions of green grass swaying in the breeze, or starry sky shining in the darkness, without any sensory reference in their own lives? These ancestral memories of Earth would gradually transform into abstract myths, impossible stories about a legendary world that would defy all credibility. For future generations on Uranus, Earth would become as fantastical as Atlantis is to us, a lost paradise that perhaps never truly existed. The very fundamental definition of humanity would be questioned and re-evaluated continuously, creating collective existential crises that would permeate all of Uranian society. With each radical biological modification that became necessary for survival, with each technological adaptation that moved them further away from the original human form, with each generation that was born, less like their terrestrial ancestors, deep philosophical and spiritual questions would torment their consciences. At what exact point would they have ceased to be human? If their bodies, their senses, their forms of communication, and their thought processes were completely different from the originals, what would truly still connect them with the species that once called Earth home? The older generations, those who still held direct memories of terrestrial existence, would suffer from a unique and devastating form of nostalgia, a permanent and inconsolable mourning for sensory and emotional experiences they could never have again. They would be constantly haunted by cruel sensory ghosts, the torturous memory of what it was like to feel the sun's heat on their skin, but with modified bodies incapable of processing that sensation, haunting echoes of songs that touched their souls, but with adapted ears that could never again hear terrestrial melodies, painful memories of flavors that once brought joy, but with modified tongues that could no longer detect these simple pleasures. Even more complex and disturbing would be the question of the Uranian children. How to educate a new generation about fundamentally terrestrial concepts like traditional family, romantic love based on physical attraction, or intimate friendship, when the physical and sensory bases that allowed for the development of these relationships simply no longer exist. How to transmit essential human values when the formative experiences that created them are completely impossible to replicate in the new environment. Loneliness would take on completely new and terrifying psychological dimensions. On Earth, even in moments of greatest personal isolation, there is always the comforting and implicit presence of the biosphere around us, plants growing silently, animals moving with mysterious purposes, and natural cycles continuing their eternal dance of renewal. There is always the subliminal sense of being part of something larger, of being connected to the web of life. On Uranus, this existential comfort would disappear completely. The silence would be absolute, and the immobility of the landscape would be total. Each inhabitant would exist as a tiny island of conscious life, surrounded by immense and eternally hostile voids. The feeling of possibly being the only conscious life in a fundamentally indifferent universe would be a constant and overwhelming psychological experience. The very perception of time would become distorted and alien. Without the comforting cycle of days and nights, without seasons to mark the passage of years, without natural processes of growth and decay to measure changes, time would lose its familiar human quality. The inhabitants of Uranus would live in an eternal, hazy now, where past and future would become increasingly abstract concepts. And yet, at the center of all these unimaginable losses, at the heart of all this radical transformation that would question the very essence of humanity, something precious and irreducibly human would remain: the questioning consciousness, the infinite capacity to create meaning even in impossible circumstances, and the determination to find purpose and connection even when all familiar references have disappeared. The inhabitants of Uranus would discover, through their deepest losses, that being human perhaps was never really defined by the specific senses we possess, by the particular shape of our bodies, or by the sensory experiences we consider fundamental. They would discover that the deepest essence of humanity resides in the persistence of the conscious mind that continues to seek understanding, connection, and transcendence, even when everything we considered essential to our identity is removed. In the end, they would learn that some of the most devastating losses can paradoxically lead to the most important discoveries about who we really are, when all superficiality is removed and only the essence remains. From the extreme adaptations and profound losses that marked the human journey on Uranus would emerge something completely unexpected and transcendent. A new form of human civilization that would not only compensate for everything that was lost, but would create possibilities of existence that our species had never imagined throughout its entire terrestrial history. On Uranus, freed from the physical and sensory limitations that shaped every aspect of human culture for millennia, a society would be born based on completely revolutionary principles that would redefine the very concept of what a civilization can become. Art would take on forms that would completely transcend anything any terrestrial human could conceive or appreciate. Without the ability to create traditional visual paintings or sculpt physical materials, Uranian artists would develop forms of expression based on the direct and conscious manipulation of pure energy and collective consciousness. Imagine symphonies composed not of sounds, but of carefully orchestrated magnetic fields that could be felt through the modified body senses, generating aesthetic experiences that would combine physical perception with deep emotional resonance in ways that our terrestrial language has no words to describe. Entire groups of telepathic artists would work in absolute mental synchronization for months or even years to create what they would call shared mental landscapes, entire worlds of pure imagination that could be temporarily inhabited by anyone willing to attune their modified consciousness to the appropriate frequencies. These artistic creations would be much more than entertainment. They would be complete alternative universes with their own physical laws, their own imaginary geographies, and their own stories and characters that would exist only at the interface between multiple connected minds. The most talented artists would be able to create artificial memories so vivid they would be indistinguishable from real experiences. They could build memories of walks through terrestrial forests they had never visited, of conversations with people who never existed, and of emotions so deep and authentic that they would permanently transform the personality of anyone who experienced them. Art would become a form of alternative reality, allowing the inhabitants of Uranus to live thousands of different lives through shared imagination. Dance would evolve to become a truly multidimensional art form that would take advantage not only of Uranus's reduced gravity, but also of the inhabitants' unique ability to perceive and manipulate invisible energy fields. Performers could sustain fluid and impossible movements in the air for extraordinary periods, creating choreographies that combined physical movement with energy sculptures that formed and dissolved in the space around the dancers. Entire groups of movement artists would develop what they would call atmospheric dances, performances where dozens or hundreds of participants would synchronize their movements with the planet's own natural air currents, transforming Uranus's gigantic storms into an integral part of the choreography. During the great storms that could last entire terrestrial years, whole communities would engage in collective dances that would last for generations, with dancers being replaced by their descendants in an artistic continuity that would extend for decades. These collective dances would become much more than art. They would be rituals of community connection that would maintain social cohesion during the long periods of isolation in the atmospheric layers. Through synchronized movement, the inhabitants of Uranus would establish bonds that would transcend family or friendship, creating a kind of collective soul expressed through bodies in perfect harmony. Literature would be completely reimagined in ways that would challenge our terrestrial understanding of what constitutes a narrative. Without spoken or written words, in the traditional sense, stories would be transmitted as complex, multidimensional patterns of thought, emotion, sensation, and memory. A Uranian book would be an experience lived directly in the reader's consciousness, not just a passive description of events, but the complete and real sensation of living through the characters' experiences, of inhabiting their minds, of feeling their emotions as if they were their own. The most skilled authors would become architects of internal realities, building mental worlds so detailed and convincing that they could be indistinguishable from real memories. They would develop narrative techniques that would allow readers to experience multiple perspectives simultaneously, living a story through the eyes of several characters at the same time, understanding conflicting motivations in a direct and visceral way. Completely new literary genres would emerge. Lived biographies, where readers could experience the complete life of a real or fictional person, from birth to transcendence. Evolutionary stories that would adapt and change based on the emotional reactions of each individual reader. And collective narratives created collaboratively by entire communities, where each inhabitant would contribute fragments of personal experience that would merge into unique community epics. The concept of time would be radically reconstructed by Uranian society. Without clear solar cycles, without seasonal changes, without the natural markers that have always guided terrestrial humanity, the inhabitants would develop calendars based on completely new collective rhythms, pulses of civilizational activity that would flow like tides through the floating communities, migration cycles of the aerial cities through different atmospheric layers following planetary energy patterns, and waves of cultural creativity that would sweep through entire civilizations like invisible winds of inspiration. Important events would be marked not by numerical dates, but by specific collective emotional states and unique planetary energy configurations. The time of the Great Convergence could refer to a period when multiple floating cities gathered at similar altitudes, creating a temporary population density that generated explosions of artistic innovation and scientific discovery. The era of deep silence would mark a period when the storms calmed down long enough to allow for previously impossible forms of collective meditation. Politics would completely transcend all known terrestrial models, evolving into forms of governance that would take advantage of the unique telepathic capabilities of the inhabitants, with direct mental communication making dishonesty virtually impossible. Traditional government systems based on representation, public debate, and rhetorical argumentation would become completely obsolete and unnecessary. Collective decisions would be made through mental consensus processes where entire communities could literally feel the emotional, practical, and ethical implications of different courses of action before choosing. There would no longer be political discussions in the terrestrial sense, just periods of shared mental exploration where all perspectives would be experienced directly by all participants until solutions satisfactory to all emerged naturally. Leaders would be selected not for charisma, verbal ability, or power of persuasion, but for their demonstrated ability to harmonize and integrate the seemingly conflicting needs of diverse groups. The best leaders would be those who could simultaneously hold multiple conflicting perspectives in their minds without losing empathy for any of them, serving as conscious bridges between different communities and points of view. Completely new forms of participatory democracy would develop, where every important decision would be tested in shared mental simulations before being implemented. Policies could be experienced in collective virtual realities, allowing the entire population to live the potential consequences of different choices before committing to any specific course of action. Education would take on forms that would completely revolutionize how knowledge and wisdom are transmitted between generations. Children born on Uranus would not learn through books, lectures, or even gradual experience. They could receive knowledge through the direct transfer of lived experience. Masters could literally share their memories, skills, and insights with students, allowing entire generations of accumulated wisdom to be transmitted instantly. However, this process would also create completely new educational challenges. How to maintain individuality and creativity when knowledge could be shared so directly. How to encourage original thought when students could simply download the experience of experts. How to develop character and emotional wisdom when pure information could be transferred without the personal growth that normally accompanies the learning process. Uranian educators would develop sophisticated methods to balance direct knowledge transfer with guided personal experience. Students would receive basic information instantly, but would then spend years exploring the personal implications and applications of that knowledge through carefully structured experiences that would allow for authentic individual growth. Spirituality would evolve to embrace concepts that no terrestrial religion had ever considered or could have imagined. In a world where direct mental communication made the deep and inescapable interconnectedness of all consciousnesses evident, where survival itself depended on absolute technological and biological harmony with the environment, philosophies based on the demonstrable fundamental unity of mind, technology, and cosmos would develop. God would be conceptualized not as a distant anthropomorphic figure ruling from a separate heaven, but as the emergent unified consciousness that was born from the perfect synchronization of all Uranian minds working in harmony. Prayer would become a form of collective meditation, where entire communities would synchronize their mental states to achieve levels of perception and understanding impossible for isolated individual consciousnesses. Temples would be multi-dimensional spaces created by energy fields, where congregations could directly experience states of elevated consciousness. Rituals would involve mass mental synchronization, allowing hundreds or thousands of people to simultaneously experience sensations of transcendence, cosmic unity, and divine connection that would surpass any known mystical experience on Earth. Memories of Earth would take on an almost sacramental status within this new spirituality. Complex and deeply emotional rituals would be developed to preserve and honor these ancestral memories. Ceremonies where entire communities would share the last authentic sensory memories of blue oceans shining under the sun, green forests whispering with life, and starry skies promising infinite possibilities. These experiences would become the most sacred sacraments of Uranian civilization, moments when the inhabitants could briefly touch their terrestrial origins through the shared consciousness of their ancestors. During these ceremonies, the entire community would temporarily experience impossible sensations: the smell of rain, the sound of the ocean, the feeling of the sun on their skin. These experiences would be so precious that only the most special occasions would justify them. Births, transcendences, and moments of civilizational crisis that required connection with the deepest roots of humanity. New forms of love and relationships would emerge from the inhabitants' unique telepathic capabilities, with mental communication allowing for absolute psychological intimacy. Romantic relationships would take on depths that would be impossible and even unimaginable on Earth. Partners could literally share thoughts, emotions, memories, and even aspects of personal identity, creating bonds that transcended anything possible through verbal communication or physical contact. These intimate relationships would be simultaneously deeper and more challenging than any terrestrial experience. How to maintain individuality when minds could merge so completely? How to process conflicts when every negative thought would be immediately perceived by the partner? How to preserve mystery and romance when secrets could not exist? The Uranians would develop sophisticated relational codes based on consensual privacy, mutual agreements on which aspects of the mind would remain private and which would be shared. Mature relationships would be characterized not by total openness, but by the ability to consciously choose when to be transparent and when to maintain mental autonomy. Completely new forms of family structures would also emerge. Mental families could be formed based on deep psychological compatibility rather than just genetic or romantic ties. Groups of people could create permanent bonds based on mental synchronization, sharing responsibilities for raising children, emotional support, and spiritual growth in ways that would transcend terrestrial concepts of a nuclear family. Death itself would be reconceptualized in ways that would offer consolation impossible in the terrestrial experience. On Earth, death represents the complete and irreversible cessation of individual consciousness, an absolute boundary between existence and non-existence. But on Uranus, where memories, experiences, and even aspects of personality could be shared telepathically, significant aspects of individual identity could persist in the minds of others, even after the cessation of bodily functions. Deeply emotional rituals would develop where people close to transcendence would deliberately and consciously share their most precious memories, their unique knowledge, their most valuable perspectives, and even personality traits with loved ones and community members. These legacy transfers would allow essential parts of who they were to continue living and influencing through the community for future generations. Death would become not a termination, but a transformation, a conscious dispersion of individual identity through the collective consciousness. Deceased people would remain present in the community through the memories, perspectives, and personality traits they had shared before transcending. This continuity would offer comfort and connection that would make grieving less devastating and more like a celebration of transformation. This entire new civilization would be animated and unified by a single transcendent purpose, the conscious and deliberate preparation for humanity's next great journey through the cosmos. The inhabitants of Uranus would not see their planet as a final destination or even as a permanent home, but as a specialized school of transformation that was methodically preparing humanity for even greater challenges and even more extraordinary opportunities. If they managed to adapt completely to Uranus, a world that should have been absolutely impossible for human life, what other seemingly impossible worlds could they conquer with confidence? What other radical transformations could they embrace without fear? What limits could they transcend using the skills developed during their Uranian adaptation? Uranian culture would be characterized by a mindset of truly infinite possibility, the deep and unshakable conviction that there are no real or permanent limits to what human consciousness can become when it is willing to embrace radical change. They would see themselves as cosmic pioneers, explorers of possibility, and architects of futures that would transcend anything that terrestrial humanity could imagine. And perhaps, at the end of this transformational journey through Uranus, this is the deepest and most lasting contribution that these inhabitants would offer to the greater cosmic humanity. The living and undeniable proof that being human is never defined by physical form, specific sensory capacities, or environmental limitations, but by the infinite capacity for conscious adaptation, transcendent creativity, and purposeful transformation that resides at the deepest and most indestructible core of human consciousness. They would demonstrate that humanity is not a fixed biological species, but an evolutionary form of consciousness capable of flourishing in any environment, taking on any necessary form, and creating beauty and meaning under any circumstances, no matter how impossible it may initially seem. Uranus was never made for us. With 4 times the diameter of Earth and 14 times its colossal mass, this cold and mysterious giant represents a challenge that should be absolutely impossible for our fragile human species. And yet, we dared to dream, to imagine, to visualize the audacious possibility of calling this hostile world a permanent home. Stop for a moment and truly contemplate the magnitude of what we are considering. Uranus is so immense that 63 planets the size of Earth would fit inside it. Its storms are larger than entire continents on our home world. Its atmospheric pressures could compress diamonds until they turn to dust. Its temperatures would freeze our blood in fractions of a second. It is a world that defies not only our biology, but our very imagination of what constitutes a habitable environment. Now, lift your thoughts even higher. Imagine the infinite, immeasurable and eternal size of God, the one who created not only this cosmic colossus called Uranus, but also Jupiter with its dozens of moons, Saturn with its magnificent rings, and billions upon billions of other stars, planets, and galaxies that extend beyond the capacity of our finite minds to comprehend. The entire universe, in all its incomprehensible vastness, is just a small expression of his infinite creative power. And yet, and this is the truth that transcends all science, all astronomy, all human imagination, this same Almighty God, creator of impossible worlds and architect of dimensions that our minds cannot fathom, chose to send his only Son to live here on our small and seemingly insignificant blue planet, to walk among us as an ordinary man, to experience our pain, our limitations, our mortality, and finally, to die on a Roman cross to offer us eternal salvation and abundant life. Let this truth penetrate deeply into your heart. You who are reading or listening to these words at this very moment are infinitely more valuable in the eyes of the Creator of the universe than this gigantic planet Uranus with all its furious winds capable of destroying entire cities, all its crushing pressures that turn rocks into sand, and all its temperatures that defy the very possibility of life. You are more precious to God than all of Uranus's 27 known moons, more loved than all the twinkling stars scattered throughout distant galaxies, and more valued than entire planets filled with diamonds and precious metals. The imaginary journey we took through Uranus, from the first desperate attempts at survival using technological suits to the complete radical transformation of our own biological nature, teaches us something profound and transformative about who we really are as beings created in the image of God. We are not defined by the apparent limits of our physical bodies, by the geographical boundaries of our home planet, or by the temporary circumstances that surround us at this moment. We are creatures of infinite possibility, shaped by the hands of a creator who designed us not just to passively survive the challenges of existence, but to transcend any obstacle, to find divine light even in the deepest and most seemingly hopeless darkness, to create beauty and eternal meaning even in the most hostile and discouraging environments that life can present. If we can imagine our species not just surviving, but truly flourishing in a world as impossible as Uranus, if we can visualize human beings creating civilizations, art, love, and purpose in conditions that should annihilate all possibility of life, how much more can we absolutely trust that the Almighty God who created this vast, mysterious, and wonder-filled universe has even greater, more beautiful, and more extraordinary plans for our lives right here on Earth? Every challenge you face in your current life, whether financial, emotional, relational, professional, or spiritual, every obstacle that seems absolutely insurmountable to your limited human eyes, every situation that seems impossible to overcome, is just a small opportunity to discover and experience the supernatural and extraordinary strength that God Himself placed within you from the moment of your conception. Think of it this way: if human beings could theoretically adapt to live on Uranus, a planet where there is no solid ground to walk on, where the air is deadly poison, where storms last for centuries, where the sunlight is so faint that it barely illuminates the eternal twilight, then you certainly have within yourself the divine capacity to overcome any difficult circumstance in your terrestrial life, no matter how impossible it may seem in the present moment. The Bible assures us with divine authority, "For I know the plans I have for you," declares the Lord, "plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah. The universe around us is too vast for our finite minds to fully comprehend, filled with worlds that defy our wildest imagination and possibilities that exceed our most audacious dreams. But at the center of all this incomprehensible cosmic immensity, there is a simple, personal, and completely transformative truth. You were created with a specific eternal purpose, designed for divine greatness, and loved unconditionally and infinitely by the one who shaped the stars with his hands. The imaginary inhabitants of Uranus that we visualized throughout this journey discovered that the greatest transformation they experienced did not happen in their modified bodies, nor in their advanced technologies, nor even in their impossible floating cities. The deepest change happened in the revolutionary understanding that being human means possessing the infinite divine capacity to completely reinvent oneself, to find supernatural hope where there seemed to be absolutely none, and to create deep community and meaning even in the most impossible and discouraging circumstances imaginable. In the same way, you have within your soul this same divine capacity for complete transformation. No matter how impossible your current situation may seem to your natural eyes, no matter how distant and unattainable your deepest dreams may be at this moment, no matter how many people have already told you that your goals are unrealistic or impractical, the same Almighty God who created Uranus and all the impossible worlds of the cosmos is actively working in your life at this very moment, preparing supernatural paths that you cannot even imagine in your most optimistic dreams. He is orchestrating circumstances, aligning people, moving resources, opening doors that have been locked for years, and preparing opportunities that will completely surprise you. Your story is not over yet. Your best chapters may be just beginning. Your greatest miracles may be forming behind the scenes of eternity at this very instant. Remember that the God who we imagined empowering human beings to live in an environment as hostile as Uranus is the same God who promises in His Word, "I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me." Philippians. If you have made it to this point, in our imaginary journey through Uranus, if you have allowed your mind to expand to contemplate possibilities that transcend apparent limitations, then you are already demonstrating something extraordinary about yourself. You have the kind of faith and imagination that God can use to accomplish the impossible in your real life. Receive this prophetic blessing over your life. You are a gem more precious and valuable than any shining star or magnificent planet in the entire universe. Your dreams are not empty fantasies, but divine seeds of infinite possibilities that God has planted in your heart. Your life has eternal purpose and cosmic meaning that extends far beyond the temporal boundaries of this physical world. You were created for greatness, destined for miracles, and designed to impact generations not yet born. The impossible that you carry in your heart, that dream that seems too big, that vision that others consider unrealistic, that calling you feel but are afraid to embrace, completely, that impossible is actually God's invitation for you to discover who He truly created you to be. Because if we could imagine human life flourishing on Uranus, if we could visualize our species transcending limitations that should be absolutely definitive, then we can certainly trust that the God of infinite possibilities has plans for our terrestrial existence that exceed everything we can dream or imagine. The impossible is just the starting point for what God can do through a life completely surrendered to Him.